guys. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone for being here, both here live in the audience and on the Zoom. I'm Scott Fisher. I'm a psychiatrist, and I'm also the lead facilitator and clinical program manager at the Center for Psychedelic Research at Siegel Trials. We're located in Broward, and Lauderhill is our Center for Psychedelic Research. Siegel Trials does a lot of sort of clinical trials, mostly drug development trials that are kind of run through the FDA to try and see if drugs are safe and effective for certain types of conditions. So in terms of kind of my pathway to working in this area, so I worked in private practice for about 8 years and did a mixture of medication management as a psychiatrist. I'm an MD, so I had a medical degree. I can prescribe medications, and also psychotherapy. I got a little bit, it was good, but just kind of felt like the current model of treatment didn't help a lot of people, and felt that maybe psychedelics would help people. Probably not all those different mental health conditions are likely to be useful for psychedelics, but we seem to think like depression, anxiety, substance use disorder, perhaps eating disorder, OCD. We have, I think like 6 or 7 different studies ongoing right now at Siegel. Psilocybin, which occurs naturally in a lot of mushrooms, is one of the key psychedelics being studied right now. So we have a study of psilocybin for major depressive disorder, study of psilocybin for medication treatment-resistant disorder, a study of psilocybin for generalized anxiety disorder. So we're actively recruiting for all of those studies. So if anyone you know, think might be interested in participating in this research, it's obviously an area I'm very passionate about, and we're looking to always recruit kind of more people to be in these studies. So just know that we are actively recruiting. New studies are starting all the time. I work in what we would call kind of psychological support, or the therapy or the facilitation of the studies, which basically means there are preparation sessions that I do with our study participants ahead of time, several hours worth usually, to kind of get to know each other, get to talk about the psychedelic that they might be taking, because a lot of these are placebo-controlled, randomized, double-blind, basically. So placebo meaning usually there's a treatment arm where they're not given really any sort of active treatment in their capsule. Randomized in the sense that they'll be kind of randomly selected to one group or another, and double-blind in that both the study participant and all the study staff don't know what they're getting. So that way we kind of try to eliminate bias and expectancy. So it's kind of interesting when you're preparing someone, you're like, well, you could just sit on a couch for 8 hours and feel no different than you usually do, or you may have a very, very altered state of consciousness, because these are high-dose studies in general. It's not microdosing. It's a large dose given within a heavily supported, psychological supportive sort of setting at our center, in a very kind of relaxed environment. Our dosing rooms feel like just kind of like someone's living room. It's not like meant to be a clinical setting. And then there's like a musical playlist that we have as well.
I was just curious, how do you source these compounds if they're kind of illegal?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So we do not primarily sponsor any of the studies. We are contracted by generally pharmaceutical groups that are doing these drug development studies. So they will find a lab that generally does a chemical synthesis of the compound. So if psilocybin is like in these studies, it's generally never coming from a fungal sort of source. It's made in a lab. And that's because it doesn't have to be that way. There are ways to do actually botanical development of drugs through the FDA, but it's kind of challenging to extract pure psilocybin from these mushrooms, because there's a lot of other compounds in there that are kind of like psilocybin, baeocystin or psilocybin. So to do a chemical extraction, just the psilocybin, which the FDA generally wants a pretty pure thing, gets really complicated. So it ends up being a little bit more simple to do a chemical synthesis of the psilocybin. So the lab will work through the DEA. They're heavily regulated. We have a DEA Schedule 1, which basically means that our license allows us to work with drugs that are on just an experimental basis. So there's the prep sessions, the dosing sessions, then we have integration sessions afterwards. So it's kind of like therapy sessions basically, or counseling sort of sessions, but it's pretty non-directive, it's pretty open-ended, it's pretty kind of more what we call more like a client or patient-centered model, there might be ways to kind of do specific types of psychotherapy, whether it's like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or psychoanalysis, but these studies keep it pretty simple and kind of at that baseline. So right now, I mean, there's really no psychedelics that are legally prescribable on a federal level. There is ketamine, which isn't technically considered a psychedelic, but is a dissociative anesthetic that at certain doses can have overlap in terms of some of the psychedelic properties that, like, say, psilocybin and LSD, but it is kind of its own distinct thing. And it is kind of being used sometimes with the psychedelic kind of mindset where people are giving it to promote an altered state of consciousness and hoping that the altered state of consciousness mediates some of the benefit of the drug. So a lot of kind of drugs that are prescribed now for depression, anxiety, things like that, it's more about symptom reduction, and we're not really interested in kind of what happens in someone's mind, you know, when they're taking it. It's just, you know, give them the drug, hopefully it fixes something in their brain. We don't know what really is happening in the brain with depression still, despite, you know, dozens and dozens of years of research. But give the drug, hopefully it fixes something in the brain, they feel better. With psychedelics, we're kind of more interested in what is the psychological experience that's going to happen. Might there be some sort of like meaningful experience that takes place? So,
So when we're looking for psychedelics, are we looking for like immediate results, or are we looking for experience to then get results?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that in a lot of the studies we've done so far, and just in what people will say, you know, people who take them just kind of recreationally, so to speak, or, you know, not in the confines of a study, a lot of people will notice pretty quick results. But our studies so far haven't really delineated whether those can be sustained over a long period of time, because there just hasn't been a lot of long-term follow-up. But the long-term follow-up that we do have shows that there are many people who will sustain a long-term benefit, say for anxiety or depression, after maybe even a single dose of, say, psilocybin or LSD. But there's no like, it seems like you can get like a rapid, like, say, antidepressant activity for, like, if you're giving it for depression, and also sustained. But there's also some people who don't respond to these, or they get better after they get better, but then they slip back into depression. So I guess the ideal would be it works quickly and lasts a long time. But I don't think everyone gets that response. But if even some people do, that's already like a pretty great improvement on, I guess, like a lot of our currently available kind of therapeutic options.
So given your previous experience, how would you compare the results of a psychedelic treatment versus like modern day treatments on things like anxiety and depression?
Yeah, I mean, there haven't been a lot of, you know, carefully controlled studies. They did do a study comparing psilocybin to escitalopram, which also goes by the name Lexapro, for depression, and it was a very small study, so it's kind of hard to extrapolate, but it looked like psilocybin worked at least as well as the escitalopram in that study, but there aren't a lot of other meaningful conclusions. My just personal opinion is that, you know, taking some of these, you know, antidepressant, anti-anxiety drugs over a long course of time can have a lot of side effects that kind of add up, you know, sometimes very quickly, and people cannot tolerate them well at all. But for other people, they might, you know, get weight gain, or other sort of, you know, weird dreams, grinding their teeth, sexual side effects that kind of can affect the quality of life for a long period of time. So what we've seen so far is that it seems like psychedelics, at least for some people, are more effective and safer with less side effects. And it's not a drug you necessarily have to take on an ongoing basis. But it is kind of relatively intensive in terms of, like, in our studies, like with the preparation, the dosing, and the integration sessions, there's often, you know, 15 to 20 hours of work with, you know, a specialist, like a therapist, during that time. So that is like kind of an added cost to factor in. But if it works a lot better, you might have kind of a cost-benefit analysis where it might make sense to give a more expensive and more effective treatment that kind of potentially helps the problem much more than a cheaper but not very effective treatment with a lot of side effects. Is that an answer? Okay, you're Any other questions before I start diving in?
I'm just curious if you could elaborate more on the pre and post session facilitation, because it seems like during the session you're encouraging, letting them explore a lot. You don't really intervene unless they might be having some real serious trouble. I don't know. Maybe you could just elaborate more about how the therapy, that whole process works, especially afterwards. Like, how do you navigate this to make it a success?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I think like it's a weird time for me as like, you know, a psychiatrist who, you know, has definitely a lot of like clinical philosophies that, you know, I ascribe to in lots of ways that I think psychedelics can work and treatment in general can work, but then that also has to be kind of differentiated from these clinical trials where it's sometimes very like, they say, this is what you need to do. Here's how much time you need to spend. Here are the exact topics that need to be covered, both in the pre and post sessions. You're right, in the dosing sessions, the treatment sessions, the setup's basically the same. The person lies down on the bed or the couch, we put on the music, we give them the drug, we usually offer them an eye mask and headphones so they can go on an interior journey, and we're there for support if they need it. But we're not necessarily encouraging them to talk the whole time unless they want to. Some people are silent for hours and hours at a time, and other people talk the entire time, and if they talk, then we talk with them too. So it's pretty open-ended, but in the pre and post sessions, the prep and integration, we are talking basically the entire time. We might do some mindfulness sessions with them sometime, you know, breathing and things like that. But so some of the studies will have as little as like an hour or two of preparation, and others will have up to 6 to 8 hours of preparation. So that's a pretty big difference in terms of like how much time you're spending with the person. For me, the number one most important like priority in these studies or in the prep session is really developing the rapport and the connection. So the person, when they're taking the psychedelic, feels relatively safe to let their mind you know, and their emotions go in whatever direction, knowing that they're there with someone that they feel they can trust. Because we feel like if they're not very trusting of us or just of the situation in general, then it could be likely to lead to paranoia or other sort of bad, like sort of side effects, adverse sort of emotional effects. So that's the number one thing, is helping people to feel like they're really being seen and heard, that they're being supported in whatever questions they need to ask of me or about the study. So that's kind of the number one thing. So the other thing that I'm really interested in doing, and this really helps develop the rapport as well, is getting to know as much about them. So I usually have people just tell me their entire life story. And you know, and again, it depends on the study. Some studies it's like, give me the 5-minute version. And then the ones where you have like the 6 to 8 hours, you can spend 2 hours just, you know, talking over their entire life. So beginning to know like why they're there, you know, what's the main sort of things happening in their life, why do they think they have, say, depression or anxiety, like what's their understanding of that. And then, so kind of getting the story of like, what's their mental health, what's their life story, what's their current life situation, any past, you know, traumas or any past successes, just like what has been the story of their life and their current life. And then we do start to talk about, okay, here's the drug that you might be getting. You know, here's some things that this might feel like. And we also include, you might not be getting the drug. And so you might also feel nothing. And what's that gonna be like for you? You're gonna be bored, you're gonna be disappointed, you're gonna be angry. You're gonna feel like you've missed your chance to get, you know, a really effective treatment, something that we as, you know, sort of a medical kind of, the FDA wouldn't consider to be an effective treatment yet, but that a lot of people already consider to be an effective treatment, like in the community. So there's a lot of expectation that if I have a trip on this drug, that's gonna help me get better. And so the people who don't feel like they have a trip when they take their capsule, they might be very disappointed, and that happens a lot.
Do you still have post sessions with people who didn't have?
Yeah, that's all regimented to be the same kind of, everyone has a similar study experience, including times with the facilitator. But we also talk about, okay, like, so what's good ways to navigate, you know, a psychedelic sort of altered state of consciousness. And that's where we really try and encourage like attitudes of surrendering, trusting, letting go, being open, kind of riding the waves rather than trying to thrash around in them and fight too much the experience, which can be hard to surrender to very powerful, challenging experiences if you're having them, but sometimes planting that seed to do so ahead of time helps people kind of either use their breath or talk with us. You know, sometimes we'll hold their hand or something during the session if that is supportive to them. Things along those lines. From the start, we tell people this is really not so much about me guiding you into like, you know, what this experience is supposed to mean or do for you. It's about me just kind of accompanying you along the way, and you know, providing, you know, kind of a sounding board. But it's really about you generating kind of the meaning and importance of whatever might happen.
I have one more question. I'll let you do your thing.
No, it's fine.
Can you tell me about music in this session? I come from a music background. I work in the industry. How important is the music? What's the role of music?
Yeah, like that's a really great question and can be like kind of a controversial like topic. What music is best during a psychedelic session? Of course, the answer is you can't say there's specific music that's best. You know, there's different people, there's different drugs, there's different kind of times of their life. So we don't have a lot of like really good study into what kind of different sort of musical experiences, how they might shape psychedelics. My opinion is that they very heavily can shape a lot of people's psychedelic experiences because music is sort of like a language of pure emotion, and that when someone's in a, you know, kind of highly suggestible and highly sensitive state, taking a psychedelic, the music can almost become like so immersive and they almost inhabit the tracks that they're listening to. So, you know, I think that actually the music can be a huge component of, you know, these drug experiences in these studies. And I think that, like, you know, probably like most people don't even understand like how big a component they can be. I mean, I think there are some people who kind of like, you know, don't really listen to it or don't pay that much attention to it because they're paying attention to other elements of it. But other people will be like, man, that music was like everything for me during the study. And so, yeah, like there's so many different, you know, musical tracks you could play, and each study has their own playlist that they ask to be used during the dosing sessions. And there's just a range of sort of tracks on there. We generally try to avoid anything with a spoken language that the person can understand because we don't necessarily want the words to be too directive of their experience. But even still, like, you know, if, you know, music really is like kind of an emotional language, it still is, to me, a very directive sort of thing. If you're playing a really sad track, it's probably more likely that person is going to experience those emotions. You know, and so I think that there's a lot more research that needs to be done. When they first started doing this research, they were doing a lot of like classical music, but that's kind of shifted now to a lot of, now like there's all sorts of different tracks on there. There'll be, you know, like a flute track and then, you know, kind of an ambient track and then maybe like a tribal track, and there's just, you know, it's really all over the map now. It's so cool. But yeah, they did a study. They compared listening to like classical music versus, I forget exactly the word, but it's music like with like sound bowls and kind of just more like those sorts of tones. And they found that people who listened to that latter, not the classical music, were more likely to have spiritual experiences listening to that than the classical, which I thought was kind of interesting finding. So, I mean, I think one topic maybe I'll jump into before we dive into this is, for people who might be interested in working with psychedelics, that's a common question is, okay, so how would I get kind of involved in this field? The short answer is we don't totally know yet because, like I said, a lot of these psychedelics haven't been approved. So we don't totally know, okay, let's say you want to be someone kind of doing the prep sessions and doing the dosing, doing the integration, like what is the pathway to being that person, or what are the possible pathways? We're not sure because they haven't been FDA approved. It's a very evolving landscape. But it seems like if you have some sort of license to practice counseling or psychotherapy, which would mean being like a psychologist, licensed marriage and family therapist, a licensed clinical social worker, what are the other ones? Mental health counselor. So generally, like either a doctoral or master's level sort of degree in counseling and licensure in that area, then you'll probably be really well positioned to then be able to work in this area in the future. That also includes a psychiatrist, but that would be kind of the MD route. Then you'd also be able to prescribe the drugs and also do the psychotherapy part. But if you're only interested really in doing, because the prescribing, it may be interesting, but for a lot of people, probably actually being in the session is more, that's my bias, I guess. Being in the session is more interesting, then like the therapist route would be fine. But if you really want to be also involved in the medical aspects of the treatment and actually prescribing the different psychedelics, then getting an MD or DO and pursuing psychiatry would be probably the route to go. Does anyone have any questions about that aspect of it?
Thank you. So I'm going the psychology route through the master's and the doctorates. What can you say that a psychologist would have a role in?
Good question. So a psychologist would be able to do like kind of exactly what I'm doing in terms of doing the preparation, the dosing, and the integration. Now, once, like, let's say some of these get FDA approved, it could be very well the case that now you have a lot of freedom to work with these drugs in very different ways than they are in the studies. So it wouldn't be, oh, you only have 6 hours of prep and you can only do one dosing session and you can only have 3 integration sessions. It could be, as a psychologist, you might work with a person for one session and then think they're ready. Another person, you might work with them for a year of like weekly sessions before you think they're ready. And then you might have the dosing schedule might be different. So the psychologist could do all that sort of like psychological support and or psychotherapy that's associated with the drug treatment. They just wouldn't be able to prescribe the drug themselves. They'd have to work with a psychiatrist or other MD who did an evaluation, thinks the person is appropriate kind of for the treatment.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you have one?
So I'm guessing that people's lives are changed, and that you've done a lot of integration process. And I wanted to ask, what's a trend that you've noticed that people take in their own lives during and after integration?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of variability in terms of that trend, but in terms of people who seem to get the high dose psychedelic, it's often very personalized, and it's based on things that are happening in their life and based on things that have happened in their life. But I guess one trend that I would often see is people will often come back just noticeably different in terms of they're smiling a lot more, they comb their hair a little bit more carefully, they're wearing brighter clothes, they're being nicer to the staff, and they're often just very much more present in their day-to-day lives. One woman mentioned, a few days after, or a week after her psilocybin session, she saw like the steam rising from her cup of coffee when she was like driving her kids to school, and she just was like, wow, that's so beautiful, and that's something she never would have done in a depressed state. Is something, which on one hand just kind of mundane, potentially, it's just steam you could see rising from any hot kind of liquid, but from another standpoint, she's like, wow, look how complex and gorgeous the pattern is. So there's sort of like a shift in that frame of reference that is sometimes seen towards, being kind of more positive, more optimistic, sometimes more creative, making more associations and things like that. So there are different phases of FDA studies. And so phase 1 FDA studies are generally people who don't have a specific diagnosis, they're just kind of safety studies. So we don't have any phase 1 psychedelic studies right now, although we may have some in the future. So someone who doesn't have a depression diagnosis or another mental health diagnosis could enroll in this study of 5-MeO-DMT that we're hoping to start sometime in the next year or so. And they're paid volunteer positions. So it's an interesting opportunity to those you usually do get the psychedelic because there's no placebo control. So that is an opportunity to get paid and get the psychedelic. Now, in the phase 2 and phase 3, you need to generally have that specific diagnosis, whether it's major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety. And there's a lot of qualifying criteria that go into qualifying for these studies, no matter what the phase. In general, we have a lot of people that we think might be a good fit for the treatment in general, but they just don't qualify for the study because of, one of the criteria ding them. So there's sometimes in excess of 50 different criteria that go into it. So it's a pretty big winnowing process. But yeah, people don't pay to be in the studies. We actually pay people to be in the studies and for their time and efforts to be involved. Well, I'm going to dive into the presentation, but again, interrupt at any point if you guys have specific things you want to talk about. So this is a brief overview of psychedelics and psychedelic research. So this is me. I already introduced myself, so I'll go through this. I will mention, in terms of getting back to, I guess, your question about some of the psychedelic things. So I did a certificate in psychedelic assisted therapy and research at the California Institute of Integral Studies. There are more and more programs like this that are popping up. These are generally for people already licensed within a specific field. So this is something you might do after, say, getting your master's or your doctoral level, and then going on to do this program. So there are sort of psychedelic specific certificate programs out there. Whether those are going to be necessary to work with psychedelics once they're approved, we don't necessarily know, but those will be something that people could do if they wanted to kind of like just delve more into this topic. So nomenclature. So psychedelic, the term was actually coined by a Canadian psychiatrist. It's from the Greek psyche, meaning mind or soul, and delos, meaning manifesting or revealing. So he was in a contest with Huxley to see who could choose the better name. Huxley is a writer who wrote a lot about psychedelics back in like the 40s and 50s. But psychedelic was the winner. Go psychiatrist. He made a little poem, to fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic. In terms of unpacking that, it kind of shows the range of experiences you can have, which is absolute misery and despair, anything you might associate with hell, or very heavenly experience, and just a pinch, meaning that they're very potent at low doses. Entheogen is another term you might hear referring to these different compounds. It means generating the divine within. That's artwork by a famous psychedelic artist, Alex Gray. And pathogen, it generally refers to MDMA and MDMA-like compounds. It means it's not a psychedelic in the sense of people kind of feeling like maybe they're dying, or their sense of self is completely being impacted, or their sort of reality testing is being impacted in a lot of ways, but more people might feel love, relatedness, connection, decreased fear, more willingness to communicate, openly with others. Hallucinogen is a word you'll still hear sometimes. It means something that makes hallucinations. Psychedelics often can kind of cause closed-eye visuals and visual kind of distortions, but people wouldn't normally be like, oh, there's like an elephant there, and with their eyes open and things like that. So most psychedelics, unless they're at really high doses or kind of unusual experiences, do they generate hallucinations, but you'll still see this term used a lot. In terms of different sort of psychedelic, like the chemical structure, so there's different types, but phenethylamines and tryptamines are two of the most common. Phenethylamine kind of looks like dopamine, which is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter, and then tryptamine kind of looks like serotonin that you'll see on the right side there. So they're somewhat analogs to naturally occurring things in our body. So psilocybin, DMT, they're all in the tryptamine category, and then the phenethylamines, you've got mescaline, the 2C series, like 2CB, 2CE, 2CB, and they're kind of more structurally analogous to dopamine. Ayahuasca is an admixture brewed from two plants in the Amazon, a root and a vine, and together these two plants potentiate each other, because DMT, which is the active psychedelic, is rapidly degraded by the body unless it's given with the ayahuasca vine, which has an enzyme blocker that doesn't allow the DMT to be degraded. LSD is a semi-synthetic invented by Hoffman in Switzerland. It's derived from ergot on rye. Ergot's a fungus. Ergot on rye, it affects various types of grain, rye, barley, etc. It was used by traditional healers in Europe for a long time to help with uterine bleeding. And so they were, the pharmaceutical company Hoffman worked for was trying to find something to help with uterine bleeding, and they invented LSD. Didn't really seem to help with that. They put it on the shelf, and then he accidentally dosed himself years later. Mescaline is, and found out this has psychoactive properties. Mescaline is active ingredient in peyote and wachuma, two different types of cacti. Peyote is in the southwest of this country, in the north of Mexico, and wachuma grows in the Andes. Ketamine, we talked a little bit about, dissociative anesthetic with psychedelic features. That was approved in 1970. It also was used in Vietnam a lot to kind of help wounded soldiers on the battlefield.
Can you talk a little bit more about ketamine and like the psychedelic like properties of it or like aspects of it? Because I had no idea that it impacts people like that. So.
Yeah. So there's various psychedelic properties that happen with ketamine that can have some overlap with other sorts of psychedelics. So lots of psychedelics can cause sort of an out-of-body sort of experience or dissociation, which ketamine can definitely do. There's often a very kind of distinct emotional change with ketamine that can include euphoria, or can include paranoia, or relaxation, or other sorts of effects like that. People can have different sort of psychological insights with ketamine that they wouldn't have kind of in their normal kind of state of consciousness. There also can be like spiritual and mystical sort of effects of taking ketamine as well. It's less likely to cause as much visual and perceptual sort of changes as say psilocybin, LSD, and things like that. But people can have some changes there as well, but usually not as prominent.
Yeah, I see you put up there salvia. What is like your experience or knowledge of salvia? Because every time I've heard of salvia, it's never been used. It's never been used in like a medical sense. And it's always been a very insane drug. Like I've barely heard any good experiences on it. So I was wondering, what's your knowledge and stuff about it?
Yeah, I would say that it's not being something explored, to my knowledge, right now for any sort of medical use. It is known to work through a different sort of receptor system than we've talked about. It works through one of the opioid receptor systems in the body, although not the one that you would normally associate with, say, heroin or other sorts of opiates. And it often has very weird or somehow dysphoric sort of states of consciousness. It is often being used in a way that wouldn't traditionally be used by indigenous people who took it. So I put it up there because it definitely causes an altered state of consciousness that people might sort of say is psychedelic in terms of feeling vastly different from their normal sense of self and their sense of self being heavily impacted. But I would agree that it doesn't seem that promising for psychedelic. Historical use. So I think a very interesting thing about psychedelics is, at least as the medical aspect of it is, it isn't like these are brand new drugs that were invented in the lab by someone last year. People have been using these for thousands of years. So there's lots of kind of de facto experts out there that are sometimes more or less included in kind of this medical research. But I think, trying to be more inclusive of the fact that there are people all around the world who have used these for a long time is really important. So there's soma, a mystery substance referenced in the Rig Vedas. We don't know what it was, but it's pretty suggestive of a pretty altered state of consciousness. We became immortal. These drops gave me freedom. Soma is the life giver, aim of all eyes, light finder, come within us. Most things you drink don't cause that reaction. There's Kykeon, which was used in Greece. We don't know what this was, but at the Eleusinian Mysteries, they would give this, whatever drink this was, and it actually was illegal to even talk about the experience kind of afterwards. It was very secretive, had a lot of ritualistic aspects to it. But this guy, Aristides the Rhetor, called the experience new, astonishing, inaccessible to rational cognition. So kind of suggestive of something. potentially psychedelic. These mushroom statues found in Mesoamerica are suggestive that people have been using psilocybin there for thousands of years. Peyote use has been identified in the Southwest from as long ago as 5,700 years ago. Ayahuasca, we're not sure. It seems like at least hundreds of years, maybe longer. Gonna skip past this one. Spanish weren't too happy about mushroom use. A lot of colonial suppression of indigenous psychedelic use. They thought it was devilry and not Christian. So a lot of indigenous users had to kind of continue using in the underground or give up because often it was punishable by death. Merck synthesized MDMA in 1912 and patented it, but didn't really explore its psychoactive use. And it wasn't until the 70s that people really realized that it had powerful kind of altered states of consciousness. Hoffman, I mentioned, he accidentally dosed himself with LSD, and then the next day, this is Alex Gray art again, he went back and dosed himself 250 micrograms, thinking that would be a small dose. It's actually a very large dose of LSD. And he had a trip, and he rode his bicycle home. It was during the war in Switzerland, so you couldn't take a car, and so he was biking home. And so now there's Bicycle Day. It happens every April to kind of celebrate him riding home on his bike on 250 micrograms of LSD. I'm just gonna skip over this in the interest of time. Lots of research in the 50s and 60s. 40 to 50,000 research subjects were given psychedelics. Oh. No, okay. So psycholytic therapy is a little bit different than psychedelic therapy in that it's given at a smaller dose to kind of help loosen inhibitions with regular kind of psychotherapy, rather than the psychedelic, which is where people aren't generally able to talk or very meaningfully during their experience.
So I had a question, but I saw that she was also.
Okay, you go ahead.
Thank you. Why was LSD and psilocybin stuff illegalized during I believe it was the 60s, 70s, and 80s, even though it showed positive outcomes?
I mean, in 1970, the Controlled Substance Act was passed under the Nixon administration, and they felt that those drugs didn't show medical use and were dangerous. Certainly there's a lot of people nowadays who think that maybe there was a political motive, and in fact, I think I have a slide coming up here where a former Nixon kind of aide had commented that there was a political motivation to potentially outline those drugs. Whether that something is really true or not, we don't know, but yeah, I mean, certainly there was a lot of kind of big societal changes happening that I think scared a lot of people and were associated with the psychedelics.
Do researchers today work with indigenous people to learn more about these psychedelics and include them in therapy?
That's a great question. Some people definitely will do that, but it isn't like a requirement that people will do that. So I would say at this point there's really not a great integration of indigenous healers with kind of people who are doing kind of psychedelic therapies or treatments in general, but there is the opportunity potentially for people to do that. And there's various organizations like Chacruan, CHACRUAN, that help NA, that help kind of engender those connections. Definitely negative adverse effects are happening and challenging experiences are happening. But it really showed that the rate of serious adverse effects is very low in the existing studies of psychedelics. So it doesn't seem like people are getting severe adverse effects very commonly. But there can be severe adverse effects that happen. But there can also be severe adverse effects that happen in placebo. Sometimes an increase in suicidal ideation happens in the people who had the low intensity or placebo experiences because they thought they missed their chance to get the psychedelic. So far, I mean, some of the big concerns are, what if someone has a really traumatizing or challenging high dose session and they just feel completely, cut wide open and, are really emotionally destabilized afterwards. And that's something that, you know, can conceivably happen and has happened in some studies, but it does seem like it's less likely to happen in the highly supportive sort of setting that we're using in these studies. But it can still happen, I think. And then, you know, in the community, if people take psychedelics, they will sometimes have manic reactions or psychotic reactions that seem prolonged beyond the duration of the drug, that can last sometimes, you know, days or weeks or longer. So in our studies, we generally don't include people who have a family history or personal history of psychosis or mania, because we think those people are at increased risk of those things happening. There's also the risk, you know, that people, when they take a psychedelic, they do something stupid or unwise while under the influence of it, which is again why we give it in the center. Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.